So we are in the second great age of imperialism, meaning that the Western European powers are colonizing Asia and Africa. The need for new resources or new places to find old resources is one of the motivations for imperialism. So, for example, if we have ever-increasing amounts of manufacturing, it's a good idea to find a new source of iron. Europe, outside of Russia, doesn't have very much gold, but Africa does. So they say to themselves, why don't we go to Africa and get some gold? And we need new resources. So rubber is a new resource. This comes from rubber trees, which do not grow in Europe and are usually found in Asia. Oil is another material that we need. There's not much of that relatively in Europe, but there is oil in Asia. So these are some of the reasons that Europe gets involved in colonization. They also need new markets. So they're looking for more resources, and the Industrial Revolution keeps gaining speed and momentum, and so they need to find more places to sell all the stuff that they are making. So Europe is expanding, Japan is expanding, and Africa and Asia and the rest of Asia become victims of this new imperialism. The only European countries actually that don't get involved, or the one European country that does not get involved, was Austria-Hungary. But over here in the United States, we start thinking, hey, everybody else is imperializing, we should do it too. Now, you might notice a little bit of a contradiction here, considering that the United States had once been colonized, been the colony of England. So yes, there is a contradiction. Our second factor for the new manifest destiny is the closing of the frontier. So just as I was talking about a minute ago, the frontier is closed. People do worry about this. They're like, what does this mean? The frontier is closed. So we realize, though, that our natural resources are limited. Like, what do you mean we don't have any more lumber? Like, this is it? Everything that's here? Yes, everything that's here. So we do start worrying about this. However, just because the Census Bureau said the frontier is closed, it does not mean that nobody goes and settles the frontier. It doesn't mean that it's populated. It just means that there's nowhere else to go. So actually, there's going to be even more settlement of the West after the frontier was declared officially closed. But this element here is mostly psychological. Our next reason is the Panic of 1893. Remember, this showed us that we had overproduction. We could not consume everything that we produced. Now, we could have produced less. We could have said, oh gee, we don't need so much, so we could just make a little less. But that's un-American. That's really not the American way. So we do not stop producing, and so we're going to have to look abroad, look elsewhere to other markets to sell our goods. Our next reason is Mahanism. Yes, that really is a word. In 1890, a U.S. Navy captain by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan, just like hand, but without the D, published a book entitled The Influence of the Sea Power Upon History. This was one of the most important books ever written by an American. Although it's now over 120 years old, it is still essentially the first book that you get at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. It's also the first, I misspoke. It's the first book you'd get at any Naval Academy actually in the entire world, as well as the first book you would get at Annapolis. It's essentially Navy 101. It says basically, hello, this is why you have a Navy. It's important to defend yourselves. Captain Mahan, who later became Admiral Mahan, looked around the world and noticed that Great Britain was the world's greatest nation at this time. They were the most powerful. Mahan wondered, how can Britain be the world's greatest power? Look at it. It's a bunch of tiny little islands with bad food off in the corner of Europe where it rains all the time. How can Britain be the world's greatest power? Why isn't it Russia? Why isn't it China? Those countries are both huge. How does it get to be England? So in studying history, Mahan concluded that while the British Isles offered relatively few economic resources, the British had become the world's greatest power for one big reason, and because it was their naval power. At this time, people said the sun never sets on the British Empire, meaning that the British had so many colonies all over the world that it was always daytime somewhere in the British Empire. Mahan saw the British Navy as the answer to the problem. How do they benefit from all of these colonies? Essentially, Britain benefits by bringing raw materials from the colonies back to Britain, where British industry manufactures goods out of those raw materials. Manufactured goods are then shipped out to be sold in the colonies, and hence Britain is the world's greatest power. And then Mahan figures it out. This only happens because Britain has the world's biggest and best navy. The Royal Navy protects all of those colonies and all of those ships with sea lanes running between Britain and her colonies. Without the big Royal Navy, Britain could not hold all the colonies and therefore would not be the world's greatest power. Mahan put this all together and told the world basically, if you want to be a great power, you need to trade. And to trade safely and effectively, you need a big navy. However, there's more. Warships in those days could not stay at sea forever, so you needed bases for ships to refuel and get food and so on. So having bases means having colonies. So in other words, as America pondered the problem of where are we going to sell our stuff, we need to sell more goods overseas, and then where are they going to get more resources overseas? And then Captain Mahan says, we're going to need a bigger navy and overseas bases for that navy. So all of a sudden, do you notice how all of these factors are forming a single bigger and more connected picture here? They're all going to combine together. Our next factor are the benefits of the American way. So this is something that we've seen before, namely the concrete belief that the American way is the best way. Democracy, capitalism, baseball, apple pie, that's the American way, and the American way is the best way, and anyone with any sense knows that. Now, that thinking, as we know, goes all the way back to the Puritans in the early 1600s. Remember how we said they came over here to be a city upon a hill? They believed that they were special people on a special mission to show everybody else in the world how to live and how to do things. Well, that trait lingered on and still lingers on in our American brains today. Americans in the late 1800s knew that we had all the answers, all the right ways to do things, and part of our special mission was to show this to everybody else. So just as it had been our destiny in the 1840s to make it all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean, by the 1900s we've done it. And so now we get to see who gets, we're going to figure out who else is going to get to benefit from the American way. Maybe it's going to be folks across the water, aka folks overseas. This traditional belief also combined, I apologize for any disruptions. I realize there's not a back button on this. So our traditional belief in the American way combined with one more thing that started to show up not just amongst Americans, but amongst Europeans too. And this was called Anglo-Saxonism. This is what British poet Rudyard Kipling came to call the white man's burden, which basically came down to this. White people are civilized and have a quote-unquote duty to Christianize and uplift the inferior, non-white peoples of the world. So again, it's the idea of the white man's burden, which was that white people are civilized and have a duty to Christianize and uplift the inferior, non-white peoples of the world. The most prominent American articulating this thinking was Josiah Strong. In 1885, he wrote a book entitled Our Country. Strong basically the whole gist of his book was that it's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it. We have to go colonize abroad because someone needs to. Now, today, we would call this pretty racist. There is certainly that element to that. But however, like all things, it's not quite that simple. This could be good or bad. One could be genuinely concerned with helping others in the best way. If one approached it with the sense that those of us who have so much try to help with those who have less, it's not quite so bad. It's just like what we do on our immersion trips. It's really good to go help people who are less fortunate. However, unfortunately, there will always be those among us who start to think that these are inferior peoples who could be controlled, ruled, or exploited. So remember back to one of the arguments in favor of slavery, that slavery provided a way for the quote-unquote inferior black people to be around quote-unquote civilized white people and thus benefit. So as you can see, Anglo-Saxonism could be implemented in different ways, and knowing human nature as we do, the odds are definitely not good that the most charitable of approaches would always prevail, even amongst Americans. So, these are the reasons that Americans become interested in overseas expansion. Notice, please, how all of these reasons have come together and are all at work. Different people start seeing different reasons to expand. A business person might be attracted by the economic reasons. A genuinely charitable person might be attracted by the notion that we are helping others. Just about every American believes that the American way is the best way, so why shouldn't we be a great power right up there with England? And what we have by around the mid-1890s is all of those things floating around, but not really going anywhere yet for two reasons. So the first reason is that we're focused on the Panic of 1893. We are so absorbed that we can't focus on other items. And the second is that there's not one single thing that pulls all of these causes together in a concrete way. The Americans, as we know, were not big abstract concrete thinkers, so these are just factors floating out there that are all around. But things are about ready to get into the concrete. So, as you know, the Panic of 1893 finally bottomed out at the time of the presidential election in 1896, and in 1897 things were definitely back on the upswing. However, by this period of time, newspapers had become very important in America. We remember yellow journalism. Well, William Randolph Hearst, the guy who built San Simeon near San Luis Obispo, and his main rival, Joseph Pulitzer, who had left money for the Pulitzer Prize, were major rivals in the newspaper business. Remember, they put in sports sections, they put in the comics. They have also a fierce rivalry. Since most people only buy one newspaper, this puts the two men into an intense competition. By the late 1890s, we have so many immigrants with limited English skills that the paper put out by Hearst and Pulitzer combined real hard news with stories like what you'd see in the tabloids. Remember, yellow journalism. So you could have a story about a speech by the president, and next to it would be a story like man trapped in caves eats nothing but his own leg to survive. So by 1897, Hearst and Pulitzer see that the economy is going better, so what are they going to write about? How are they going to sell papers? A bad economy was big news, so you had to write about how bad people were. How bad things were. Now that the economy is good news, what are you going to do? Notice how the news people are the same in the 1890s and today. So good news is boring, but bad news is, well, news. So this is why our newspapers and TVs are full of stories like plane crashes 200 instead of thousands of planes landed safely today, and millions of people are safe at home with their loved ones. So Hearst and Pulitzer are trying to sell papers, but the economy's not going to sell it. So they look around, and this is where we get that concrete thing that connects all the reasons above that are just floating around out there. This is going to be the Cuban Revolt. So, as you'll recall, We said Spain had established themselves back